After work last night, I met my wife for a break. We had a brief respite from the intensity of the past few weeks leading up to Pesach. And of course, we needed a break, like I think all of us do, from the intensity of the war in Gaza that erupted over the past few weeks here locally on college campuses like Columbia University. The intensity, of course, was in the epicenter, just 10 blocks from here. And so we needed a break, need a break. Need to go get some wine and maybe some good food on the Upper West Side. So after a lovely dinner, which was interrupted not more than 3 times by people wanting to talk about Gaza with me. It's what you get when you go to a restaurant like on the corner of 89th Street and Broadway. We're walking home and we have to walk by Anshe Chesed, which is a large conservative flagship synagogue, and it happens to be on the same block as our home. So we're walking by and recognizing that many of the Upper West Side religious and spiritual elite were actually entering the space last night, watching them walk in. We asked what was happening, and we were told that there's a panel discussion on the Jews and the left happening tonight here in Anshe Chesed. And as many of you know here in the shul, in the community, and online, that this is a topic that I have been wrestling with very publicly in the aftermath of October 7th. And so listening to a public conversation felt like a great opportunity to hear new voices and new perspectives, check in on my assumptions and biases, etc., get a chance to walk my talk in the world, sitting with people who disagree, probably with many things that I've been preaching. As many of you know, I'm a big believer in listening even to those with whom I vehemently disagree, perhaps especially with those kinds of folks. After all, I am the rabbi whose maybe most well-known sermon was stay in the room. So I wanted to stay in the room. So I asked permission from Ariel, and she gave me permission to go. The panel comprised 4 women and a moderator, husband of one of our clergy. There were 2 well-known Zionists, liberal as they were, one well-known progressive denizen of progressive politics, and the editor of Jewish Currents, a well-known, extremely progressive magazine. So here's what I learned. I lasted 45 minutes of an hour-and-a-half long program. Instead of discussing the left directly, we all listened to about 35 minutes of discussion about the campus protests. Universities are generally seen as bastions of progressivism, and so discussing the protest phenomena was seen as a kind of proxy for the left writ large, more broadly construed. So that was number 1. Number 2, that protesters, we were told last night, are not being violent, but the Jews are the ones who are inciting the protesters, who are peaceful Palestinian supporters, and then several anecdotes were procured as proof of that, including one phone call with some rabbi at a Northwestern. Number 3, I learned that the chant from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, is innocuous because most of those polled about it didn't know what it really meant, and so it didn't matter. And even though many Jews, myself included and others who do know what it means, that it is a call for the wholesale removal or ethnic cleansing of Jews and Israelis currently living in Israel, but no big deal because a large portion of people who say it don't really mean that. So that should make us feel better. The 4th thing that I learned, make sure that in all instances of civil discourse, you allow the most radical and possibly marginalized person to dominate the conversation so as to showcase your extreme capacity to listen to that which you should make your stomach turn, thereby proving that you have a more evolved liberal heart and mind. Even on a panel within the 4 walls of a synagogue, the most radical and insulting ideology on the panel, laced with half-truths and distortions, found an audience eager not to listen, but to show it can. And 5, make sure to take time to name the biggest danger as not, the biggest danger facing Jews today is as not voting for Democrats who publicly libel Israel as genocidal, condescendingly browbeat anyone in any audience who has the audacity to put their Jewish identity or survival above the imperative to link arms with ethnic minorities who are out on the street calling Israelis and fellow Jews baby killers. And it's done with a tisk tisk. Don't you know better? You should vote not for your own self-interest. That's narrow. Definitely don't admit how hypocritical it is to name Israeli politicians as being extreme, even as you lecture all of those in the audience that we should vote for someone like Jamal Bowman, who is a rabid anti-Zionist and I would argue anti-Semite. So, my awakening was complete. I have come to you not seeking absolution, but to remind you that my awakening vis-a-vis progressive worldviews and political parties happened, as many of you know, years ago in 2019. And just like tomorrow morning's Parsha, or Torah reading, my awakening had much to do with a goat. In my case, the goat wasn't literal, it was the acronym for greatest of all time. It was an acronym used by Tamika Mallory, one of the organizers of the Women's March in Washington, when she tweeted a picture of herself standing with the known rabid anti-Semite Louis Farrakhan, and Tamika used GOAT, greatest of all time, to describe Farrakhan. Understandably, Jews and Jewish leaders were extremely disappointed and hurt by Mallory, as one of a group of very progressive rabbis invited to a private closed-door meeting with Tamika Mallory and the pro-Hamas activist Linda Sarsour. I took a principled stand. I demanded that Mallory apologize and retract her offensive tweet. One of the present rabbis stood up and reprimanded me, saying I should be ashamed for mistreating my ally. The other goat tomorrow morning, in Achrei, chapter 16 of Leviticus, we encounter the strange ritual of the scapegoat. In this ancient ceremony, the Torah commands that we take two goats identical in every way and cast lots, designating one as Ladonai, for God, to be sacrificed in the temple, and the other to be sent into the wilderness, cast out into the wilderness. Or as the Protestant biblical translator William Tyndale named it, the escape goat. Right? Scapegoat from escape, the goat that got away or was sent away. In the scapegoat ritual, the community's sins are symbolically transferred to a goat who is then driven into the wilderness to bear the burden of those transgressions. And as we reflect on that ritual, we are reminded of the enduring relevance it holds in our contemporary world, particularly amidst the resurgence of antisemitism, and especially on this weekend before Holocaust Remembrance Day. In Leviticus 16, we witness the Israelites taking responsibility for their collective sins. They acknowledge their failings, and seeking atonement before God, they take their hands and place their hands onto this goat, striving for repentance. They put their sins onto the goat, but first acknowledge that they have sinned. Historically, the significance of the scapegoat, though, came to mean something very different than an honest self-evaluation and an honest accounting and owning of sins. It, in fact, became the exact opposite meaning, historically. Scapegoat became another word for deflection. To scapegoat wasn't to own and give away, it was to deny and deflect. In fact, the scapegoat ritual has more than one deflection. The first deflection, according to the scholar René Girard, who was an influential French thinker, he wrote that the need for a scapegoat arose in societies that were prone to internecine conflict. And the scapegoat became a third entity, right? A third entity that could unite and divest those two aggressive parties in a socially harmless way. To serve successfully in that capacity, a scapegoat had to be relatively weak and a relatively weak outsider who could be portrayed as a threat by whichever group it served. You see where I'm going with this? Jews fit that description perfectly. The weak outsider who could unify tribal groups. Dare I say, it's pretty obvious that politicians of every stripe and color use this method, creating a bogeyman, a scapegoat of some kind. It's the immigrants this year. Next year, it'll be something else. But almost always, it's the Jews, when they were weak, who helped to unify groups that would otherwise not be able to be in the same room with one another. As long as they can hate the Jews, then everything was okay. But clearly, with the birth of Israel and the end, to some degree, of the weak Jew archetype, that's still the end to that kind of deflection, socially speaking. One couldn't unify over the Jews any longer when they were no longer weak, when they had an army of their own. And so a second kind of deflection, more insidious, more invidious, more dangerous, in my opinion, and more, in my opinion, more obvious on the left than anywhere else, was the kind of deflection that assuages and expunges a sense of guilt. The scapegoat is no longer that third entity that unifies parties that are arguing with one another or hate one another. The scapegoat is the source of a deep relief of guilt, a deep letting go of that which we feel we've transgressed, but now we put onto the scapegoat. You are holding the shadow of our culture. You hold the sins of our culture. This ingenious strategy connects the scapegoat with the second meaning by telling us that Jews are uniquely now no longer weak, but uniquely guilty in the West for all of the West's perceived sins. The easiest way, said Professor Scott Galloway from NYU, to identify oppressors is how white and how rich they are. Fairly or unfairly, Israel is seen as ground zero for whiteness and wealth. We might add other things. Ground zero for colonialism. Ground zero for aggression, fascism. On college campuses across the country, Israel and Zionism are being scapegoated as being European, religious extremists. And here's the kicker, genocidal. Genocide is, of course, the worst thing that you could ever say to a Jew, after all. This entire laundry list looks exactly like the things that were perpetrated against us. And there's a reason for that. Scapegoating Jews is a way for the Gentile and non-Jewish world to deal with their own sense of guilt. They were the ones who were genocidal, and now look, the Jews are also genocidal. Come join the club. We were the colonizers. We ruled the world. Now the Jews are the colonizers. They're not so special, are they? They're not the chosen people. Look at them. Look at the way they behave. Baby killers, we have them too. Scapegoating the Jews. This remarkable phenomenon, this blaming and expunging guilt, is always a way for Jews to lose. And instead of recognizing and addressing this pervasive issue of scapegoating, some are choosing to say it's not happening or that we're using the antisemitism card. And many of them are Jews. Jews who are the token Jews at the camping sites in various communities, Jews who are paraded out to tell everybody not all Jews agree with what Israel is doing. You can see them on shows, rabbis in big communities, coastal communities, parading out. All we have to do is just find our friends and talk about peace. And all the while, Jews lose. And the Jews who lose are the Jews who have the audacity to say that my identity includes being a Zionist. I want to say I'm a Zionist. I want to say that I support the state of Israel. I want to say that it's a part of my identity. No Zionists allowed. No Zionists allowed. The refusal of certain factions, including some within the Jewish community, to denounce anti-Semitism that masks as anti-Zionism unequivocally is a sham. It is a shame. It is a blight on our community. Let's be clear. Criticizing Israeli policies, like Israelis who were gathered for 9 months in squares around Tel Aviv and in Jerusalem fighting against judicial reform. Has anybody here who knows an Israeli that is happy with government? To be an Israeli citizen means you have to be upset with some aspect of what the government is doing, on some level. It isn't inherently anti-Semitic. It is not inherently anti-Semitic, just as critiquing the actions of any government is not necessarily an indictment of its people. However, when such criticism devolves into the denial of Israel's right to exist, no Zionists allowed, the propagation of hateful stereotypes about Jews or about Israelis, or the endorsement of violence against Jewish individuals, it crosses a dangerous threshold into anti-Semitism. And that means that even though anti-Semitism is not always anti-Semitic, it's almost always anti-Semitic. And it's always dangerous to actual living Jews. The double standards that we see being paraded around. When Scott Galloway went on the news and noted that by comparison, the United States wasn't ever accused of genocide, even though it killed 400,000 individuals in Afghanistan and in Iraq, or after the US killed 3.5 million Japanese following the attack on Pearl Harbor. And we could go on and on with the list of those countries who fought wars and who hold Israel to double standards, trying to fight a war now for its own survival. He writes, everyone but Israel is allowed to fight until surrender. Everyone but Israel. There's just a different standard for Jews in Israel when it comes to prosecuting a war. They're allowed to fight back to a truce, but unlike America or any other Western nation that has been attacked so viciously, they're not allowed to win the war. Those who stand with the pro-Hamas and pro-Palestinian camps either express an antipathy towards an Israel that is a caricature of what it actually is, a monster created and shaped by the pre-given facts of the worldview that has come to be the assumed posture of any enlightened or evolved human being. The catechism, facts whose refutation or even mere skepticism is perceived as heresy, colors all perception and are the building blocks of the almost inevitable demonization of our homeland. Israel is genocidal, but Hamas are liberators. Has any crazier statement ever been made in the history and annals of human life? It's remarkable. A full-fledged multicultural democracy is portrayed as fascistic. At the same time, Hamas and Hezbollah are part of the resistance and are thanking on social media all of the college students who've come out in support of their cause. Here's what I wish that panel that I stopped into, that respite that was interrupted. The panel last night, I wish these questions would have been asked. Does your moral leadership as a liberal Jewish leader lead to more Jewish life or more endangered Jews? I wanted to ask the panel last night, but I couldn't stay. I wanted to ask them, how do you reconcile your belief in the left with its response on October 8th and 9th and 10th, before any Israeli bombs were dropped? I wanted to ask the left a simple question about whether it's possible for a Zionist, whom you claim is a colonizer and land thief, to actually anticipate safety in your spaces. How is it possible to promise safety when you're calling Israelis land thieves and genocide baby killers? How are those things not in a recipe for Jewish danger? I wanted to ask the left why it assumes that Jews must vote above all else, not for their own self-interest, but for the larger interests of the body politic. Does anybody say that to the African American community? Does anybody say that to any of the other sub-minorities in this country? What is the presumption that we must vote for people who are decidedly, avowedly anti-Zionist, and by extension, anti-me and you? I want to ask those questions. And I want to ask, lastly, on this week before Yom HaShoah. How can the left promise me and you, descendants of real people who lost thousands upon thousands of relatives, who believed in the promise of liberalism and of the West, who believed in the power of democracy, who trusted that their space and place in Germany and other countries was assured, because after all, we all agree. How can the left promise me and all of us in this room that their rhetoric, in my opinion, they're dangerous, kowtowing to aggressive, anti-democratic sources, will not lead to my own family having to flee New York City, having to run away to the only Jewish country in the world? So as you see, last night didn't go exactly the way that I wanted it to go. The respite that I had hoped for and the heart opening that I had prayed for, my desire, as all of you do, to be at last back in the game of just talking about Torah, Ingber, just talk about Torah. Let's just talk about Yiddishkeit. Let's all sing songs together. It's still going on. And it's going on closer and closer to our doors. So I just want to leave this community. I want to leave this community with a question for us, which is, what do we do if we discover that the basic tenets of the worldview that we held for so long are the causes antecedent to our own insecurity and our own demise? I just want to ask it like as an abstract question that we might one day have a panel on, but what are we willing to give up to survive? If we find that our universalism is at odds with our own people's survival, in the way that it's constructed, in the way that it's led, in the way that it's spoken to, are we still willing to play Russian roulette with our existence? It's a question I'm holding with absolute seriousness. It keeps me up at night. It wakes me up in the morning. I live it. I breathe it. I walk around New York City with it. I'm asking myself questions that I never thought 20 years ago that I would ever ask. And I'm a little bit scared sometimes of the answers that my heart keeps telling me. And I think that we too should be a little bit scared. There's a lot of work still left for us to do, even as the students will take a break and hopefully give us a break. But I challenge this community, and by extension, any Jewish leader who's watching this anywhere, to give me good reason to trust the left. I don't know what's left any longer.